Here's the cruel joke of the story. Lena thinks the fall is the tragedy. It isn't. The tragedy is that going home would have been worse. So when Adrian catches her, this isn't romance, not yet. This is the exact second the script looks at her shattered life and says, nope, we're not done ruining and rebuilding you. Because the most devastating twist in this story is simple. The moment she is finally caught is the moment she realizes she never wants to go back.
When a psyche has been shattered, respiration shifts from an autonomic function to a conscious effort. An external agent often determines its continuation. The subject, Lena Carter, expected no intervention. Hope was an emotional resource she could not access. After a 16-hour shift with a volatile aggressor awaiting her, her collapse was arrested before impact. The intervener was Adrian Valente, an individual operating within social strata beyond the subject's comprehension. The pattern of ecchymosis on her skin served as a diagnostic map, one that would fundamentally alter her life's trajectory. She could not know this intervention was merely the precursor to an ordeal far exceeding mere survival. This incident poses a key question. What is the ultimate price of being saved? For 16 hours, the harsh, sterile lighting of Mount C's emergency ward had induced sensory overload. A somatic pain manifested in her feet, the result of footwear that had exceeded its functional lifespan by 3 months. Caffeine ingested during the 12th hour had become a visceral irritant, and fine motor tremors were visible as she completed the final chart of her extended duty cycle. "Carter, your appearance is spectral," a colleague, Dr. Marcus, observed in passing, his pace unaltered. The comment may have contained vestigial concern, but he offered no pause. In this high-stress environment, stasis is failure, motion is survival. Her lack of a verbal response indicated profound cognitive and emotional exhaustion. A former version of her psychological profile retained access to sarcasm as a coping mechanism, even in states of depletion. That persona predated Ethan, the hostile domestic environment, and the shift to a pure, survival-based existence. She terminated her shift at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before midnight. Uncompensated labor was a systemic constant. Its relevance was negligible. The institution functioned on momentum and statistical probability. The city was a system in crisis, and nurses like Lena were the failing components attempting to maintain equilibrium. Outside, the November air was a sharp, incisive stimulus, a precursor to the deep cold of winter. Her thin coat, acquired 3 years prior from a charitable distributor, offered inadequate thermal protection against the winds on East 100th Street. The bus, with a stop 2 blocks from her residence, was the logical transport. However, with a fare of $2.75 against a balance of $11.32, the subway was the only viable option. The walk to the 103rd Street station was a 12-minute exercise in controlled movement. Lena engaged in rote step counting to suppress both syncope and the anticipatory anxiety of her return. Ethan would be present. He was a constant presence now, following the loss of an employment position he had attended erratically. His state of intoxication was a near certainty. He would deploy his standard catechism of psychological abuse, inquiries about her location, her interactions with men, her perceived professional arrogance. The questions were instruments of control. A vibration in her pocket served as confirmation. It was him. The textual assault had commenced around the 14th hour of her shift. A digital flood of messages saturated her device, each exhibiting escalating paranoia and hostility, demanding a response to his fabricated narratives of infidelity. She understood that engagement would escalate his rage. Silence would also provoke it, but delayed the inevitable confrontation for several hours. The station's environment was overwhelmingly negative, a space of deep-set grime and sensory assault. The discolored tiles were coated in filth, and the air was a compound of urine and refuse. A train's screech in the tunnel signaled an arrival time that varied between 2 and 20 minutes. The Wednesday night platform was largely empty, but for a cluster of adolescents exhibiting loud, unregulated behavior. A male subject in damaged attire was visibly intoxicated and unstable. Near a support column, two women in medical uniforms conversed in low, fatigued tones. Lena positioned herself between them, releasing her backpack to the floor. The sudden removal of its weight induced a sharp, localized sensation of relief in her shoulder muscles. The bag's contents constituted her entire support system. One clean pair of socks, a depleted water bottle, 3 nutrition bars rationed since Monday, and a paperback novel she had lacked the cognitive energy to access for 6 weeks. She had previously used reading as a dissociative coping strategy, finding comfort in narratives with predictable resolutions. Her own life offered no such structured outcome. Her reality consisted of a contaminated transit platform near midnight, a state of exhaustion penetrating to the cellular level, and the man at home who would use his fists as a form of communication. In 11 hours, the cycle would repeat. The platform's stability seemed compromised as scotomas formed in her visual field. When was her last caloric intake? The nutrition bar at 6? Or was that the previous day? Time had compressed into a singular, painful loop of labor, fear, and a fatigue so profound it had a tangible quality. She required a seated position. The thought was a clinical self-assessment identifying symptoms of systemic failure, vertigo, tremors, diaphoresis in the humid air. Her vision tunneled to a single point. These were classic indicators of the platform's axis shifted violently. A rational part of her mind corrected the sensory input. The platform was static. Her own physiological systems were failing. Lena's knees buckled, and the contaminated concrete surface rose to meet her. In that final second, her cognitions were of the floor's filth, the potential stain on her uniform, and Ethan's predictable rage at her disheveled state. But impact never occurred. Instead, a pair of strong, controlled hands arrested her fall, receiving her with an efficiency that suggested significant practice. For a disoriented moment, she classified the experience as a hallucination. A voice then penetrated her auditory confusion. "Easy. I have you." The tone was male, with a notable absence of alarm. It was the voice of an individual for whom crisis is a baseline state, as if intercepting a collapsing subject was a routine event. Lena's focus sharpened. She was upright, supported by a stranger who had emerged from the ambient shadows of the station. Her initial automatic assessment was of socioeconomic class. His coat's wool fabric was valued at more than her monthly rent. His leather footwear was from a retailer whose entrance she could not afford to cross. A watch on his wrist reflected the dim light with the intensity of a star. Then she registered his face, and all calculations of material wealth became irrelevant. He was not conventionally handsome. His features were too severe for such a classification. Prominent zygomatic arches, a rigid jawline, and a nasal bridge showing evidence of at least one prior fracture. His dark hair was styled back from a face of indeterminate age between 30 and 45. But his eyes were the dominant feature, arresting all other observations. Their color mimicked an approaching storm front, irises that absorbed all data and revealed none. They were currently fixed on her face, performing a rapid analysis with an intensity that triggered a fight-or-flight response. She was paralyzed. "You lost consciousness," the man stated, his tone flat, a simple declaration of observed fact. "I'm fine." The lie was a conditioned defense mechanism, a tactic developed over years of attempting to minimize her presence and avoid conflict. You can release me now. I'm fine. His grip, however, did not yield. What was your last meal? The directness of the question bypassed her scripted defenses. 6, I believe. A granola bar. 6. He repeated the word as if it were a foreign artifact. It is nearly midnight. I worked a double shift. That explains the uniform. His gaze lowered, conducting a swift, clinical survey that was less an intrusion than a diagnostic scan. The inventory was total, and when his eyes returned to hers, their expression had fundamentally shifted. A physiological chill unrelated to hypoglycemia passed through her. He had seen it. The contusion. She had taken meticulous care to conceal the mark near her eye, where Ethan's ring had broken the skin 3 days prior. Long sleeves hid the evidence on her arms. A high-necked shirt was her final layer of concealment. But this man, with his expensive coat and storm cloud eyes, had just assimilated the entire unwritten history of her trauma in under 30 seconds. I'm fine, Lena reiterated, pulling back with the surge of adrenaline that prompted him to release her. She braced herself against a pillar. Thank you for the assistance. A dizzy spell, I am fine. Her third such declaration. He maintained his distance, his observation a form of clinical assessment. His stare was uncomfortably diagnostic. Repetitive reassurance is often a marker of genuine distress. Her response was a weak attempt at deflection. Perhaps I desired clarity. His delayed response. Your statement is clear. A beat. Its veracity is what I question. The external stimuli were irrelevant. Adolescent laughter, a psychotic episode nearby. The urban cacophony of sirens and horns served as the auditory backdrop for profound isolation in New York. Every somatic impulse in Lena's body urged immediate flight. A retrieval of her bag and a retreat into the tunnel system to create distance from this man who observed too much. She should not be here, subject to his study, like a clinical problem he was intent on solving. But her limbs were unresponsive. The black spots persisted in her vision, and moving 10 feet felt like a task beyond her capacity. Which line are you awaiting? The man inquired, his voice a low-frequency rumble. The A, Lena answered, a feeble attempt to reclaim agency. The A train, its arrival frequency is every 7 to 12 minutes tonight with luck. Are you traveling uptown towards the Heights? He made a small, affirmative nod, a silent acknowledgement of a confirmed hypothesis. That journey would take a minimum of 40 minutes. He deemed her objective unachievable. I will succeed. You will succumb. This statement was less a dispute than a clinical verdict delivered with finality. Her tremors, her observable exhaustion, the very architecture of her suffering, they formed a complete diagnosis. She required warmth, sustenance, and stasis. Medical intervention was logical. Her refusal was predictable. Lena's affect was cold. Are you a physician? No. Then cease your amateur analysis. A micro-expression of a smile appeared, a valid counterpoint. Yet the observation remains accurate. His correctness was the primary source of her agitation. Lena registered the final depletion of her energy reserves. A profound chill radiated from her core, contradicting the humid station air. As her adrenaline subsided, each contusion activated. Her options were to lose consciousness en route, or to return home, presenting Ethan with evidence of her ordeal. The inscrutable male produced a mobile device, a superior model she associated with surgical chiefs. He transmitted a message with practiced efficiency before his focus returned to her. My transport is 2 blocks away. My driver's arrival is 3 minutes. I suggest a 20-minute interval for nourishment and recovery. Subsequently, should you maintain your objective, he will convey you. The offer contains no conditions, no secondary motives, merely a warm meal and a place to sit. Yet every defense protocol established across 3 foster homes signaled an alert. Men of his refinement do not engage in acts of altruism. They do not intervene in a fall and manifest a private vehicle. A motive is always present. An agenda is the only reliable factor. But her exhaustion, it was a palpable force, eroding her volition. She was fatigued by the anxiety, the gastric emptiness, and the fiction that her apartment was a sanctuary. Why? The query was barely audible. The severe contours in the man's face softened marginally. Because, he stated, his vocal tone lowering, I recognized that expression. It is the one seen when viable options have been exhausted, and I cannot remain passive when I possess the means to intervene. Before Lena could formulate a response, headlights saturated the tunnel. The A train entered the station, its brakes shrieking as the doors opened. The assembled crowd surged forward. Youths pushed past. An intoxicated man stumbled aboard. The stranger, however, remained a locus of calm, his gaze fixed on her, awaiting a decision. Lena's focus shifted to the train, to the route toward her apartment, toward Ethan, and the recursive pattern of her trauma. She then redirected her gaze to the stranger. 20 minutes, she vocalized, then I must return home. The lie felt caustic on her tongue. Home was the one place she sought desperately to evade. It was the only scripted response she possessed. He replied with a single, sharp nod. 20 minutes. He motioned toward the exit, synchronizing his pace with hers as she retrieved her bag. Behind them, the subway doors emitted a warning chime and sealed. The A train departed, leaving Lena Carter to the night with an unknown male. Ascending the stairs was analogous to climbing a summit. Each step was a conflict against her trembling limbs. The man walked alongside her, maintaining no physical contact, yet his proximity was an implicit assurance against her falling. His presence was a tangible pressure, though his forward gaze granted her the illusion of privacy. The November air impacted her like a physical blow, colder than her memory of it. Her teeth began to chatter in an involuntary betrayal. A black luxury sedan was parked curbside, its lustrous finish projecting a degree of wealth that nearly prompted Lena to retreat back down the stairs. A man in a suit, perhaps 60, stood by the vehicle with a neutral expression. Adrian, the driver acknowledged with professional calm. Not sir, not Mr. Valente. A first name. The stranger's designation was Adrian. Marcus. Our itinerary has been revised. A detour is required before we proceed to the office. Marcus's gaze shifted to Lena, a brief clinical assessment that mirrored his employer's. He processed the uniform, the fatigue, the concealed injuries. But unlike Adrian, his driver's mien was completely unreadable. He simply nodded and opened the car door. The destination? A discreet location. An establishment open through the night, serving actual food, not merely coffee. I have a place in mind. Adrian gestured for Lena to enter the vehicle. She hesitated, a lifetime of cautionary narratives cycling through her mind. But the wind was sharp, her legs were failing, and the heated car became an inevitability. The vehicle's interior was a different environment of leather and the subtle aroma of another existence. The seats were heated. As Lena settled into the soft material, a sound like a suppressed sob lodged in her throat. How long had it been since she experienced this level of pure physical comfort? Adrian sat beside her, maintaining a formal distance. Marcus secured the door, the engine a faint hum, a separate reality from a rattling bus or Ethan's failing Civic. As they merged into traffic, Lena watched the city dissolve into vectors of light and color. She was conscious at some level of the need for fear. Her cognitive function should have been mapping their route, formulating escape plans, preparing for a worst-case scenario. But for the first time in an extended period, she was warm and stationary, and her injured body had declared a truce with her hypervigilance. "How long have you practiced nursing?" Adrian's question broke the silence. Lena turned toward him. By the cabin's low illumination, she could discern the fine lines around his eyes, strands of silver in his dark hair. He projected an image of perfect composure, a man who had seemingly purged all superfluous motion. 4 years, she replied, or 3 years and 8 months precisely. Do you derive satisfaction from the work? Did she? Lena could not recall if she ever had, or if it was simply the most viable option when the state discharged her with no resources. I am competent at my job, she offered as an alternative. It is not the same thing, I am aware, but it is a factor. Adrian nodded as if her answer held profound significance. And what vocation would you select if all paths were available to you? The question was dissonant. No one posed such hypotheticals to her. They inquired about her shifts, her level of exhaustion, the latest crisis. One does not discuss aspirations with a person in survival mode. I am uncertain, she admitted. Then the strange intimacy of the warm vehicle seemed to disinhibit a part of her. I considered teaching once, she added. Young children, perhaps. I enjoyed their company. She ceased abruptly. Before what? Before the foster system taught her that attachment was a vulnerability. Before Ethan demonstrated that desire only armed another person with a weapon to harm you. Before you concluded it was impractical, Adrian completed her sentence, his tone perfectly neutral. Something to that effect. They traveled several blocks in silence. Lena observed a different section of the city pass by. Small shops, diners, silhouettes and doorways, all in a state of waiting. The city post-midnight was an entirely different organism. More primal, more exposed, stripped of its illusions regarding its own needs. Marcus guided the car onto a quiet side street, parking before a diner unfamiliar to Lena. A blue and white neon sign hummed a single word, Athena's. Inside, a few solitary patrons occupied booths, nocturnal workers, insomniacs, displaced individuals with no other destination. 20 minutes, Adrian repeated, reflecting her own terms back at her. Sustenance, warmth. Then I will ensure you reach your destination. Lena could only nod, unwilling to speak, unwilling to risk what she might say if she did. A truth such as please do not return me there, or I do not know how much more of this I can tolerate, or simply I am profoundly exhausted by the pretense. Marcus opened her door. The cold entered but felt remote. Adrian exited, then turned and offered his hand to her. For a long, silent moment, she only observed it. His hands presented a clinical contradiction. Immaculate grooming overlaid on calloused flesh, evidence of a past his attire sought to obscure. A fine linear scar across the knuckles suggested a history of closed trauma. She initiated contact. His grip was stabilizing, a calculated support devoid of sentiment. He disengaged upon her stabilization. The diner's warmth offered a brief environmental shift. An attendant, exhibiting signs of chronic fatigue, assessed their disparate appearances, Adrian's affluence versus Lena's service-class attire, and directed them to a rear booth. Coffee, she proposed. We will begin with water, Adrian interjected, preempting Lena's reply. Then coffee, if she desires it, and 2 orders of your most substantial dinner entree. Nothing from the breakfast selection. The server, Deb, raised an eyebrow but offered no comment. The meatloaf is reliable. It is served with mashed potatoes and green beans. Adrian looked to Lena, who managed a small nod. Too depleted for decision-making? 2 meatloafs, then, Adrian confirmed. And please ensure the water is replenished. After the waitress departed, Lena fixated on the worn table surface, an object etched with innumerable silent histories. She observed her own hands beside his phone. They showed contusions, one bandaged from a mishandled needle the previous day. His hands were immaculate, a manifestation of his absolute control. "You are not obligated to do this," she murmured. "Do what, specifically?" "This entire rescue of a distressed female protocol." "I am functional." "Ah, so we have advanced from a single word to a complete sentence. This is progress." The mild provocation was effective, and she felt the neurological echo of a smile. It was a forgotten feeling, a muscular memory she had nearly lost. Deb returned with 2 glasses of ice water and 1 coffee. Lena drank half the water in a single, urgent gesture. Her stomach spasmed in protest, but the cold shock felt cleansing. She had been unaware of the true depth of her own dehydration. "Regulate your intake," Adrian stated. The words a clinical observation, not a command. "You risk systemic shock." Her retort was a textbook defense mechanism. "An armchair diagnosis," he countered. "A logical conclusion based on observing depleted systems fail." At this, Lena set the glass down with force, her gaze fixing on his. "And what establishes your expertise? A pattern of rescuing collapsed nurses on public transit?" "No." Adrian relaxed into his chair, a disquieting placidity masking his features. "But I have staked my survival on unknown variables in human form." His assessment bypassed her defenses with surgical precision. Her question was a deeply conditioned, reflexive act of defiance. His analysis was correct. She was a creature long adapted to scarcity, conditioned to perceive abundance not as salvation, but as a lure. He described a psyche that apologized for its own footprint, a personality that pathologized desire as a defect. The accuracy of the profile was a palpable pressure, forcing her to break ocular contact with his penetrating gray eyes. Her entire defense structure failed. "No," Lena admitted, "I do not. His hypothesis was supported by the physical evidence from the platform and the clear narrative etched into her skin. A dense, weighted silence descended, broken only by the percussive sound of her own pulse. The situation called for a well-practiced deception, yet the metabolic cost of her constant persona management had become its own form of torment. "This is not your clinical problem," she deflected. "You are correct. It is not." The arrival of dinner created a rupture in the standoff, the aroma of meatloaf and potatoes, an artifact from a discarded existence. The server withdrew, leaving Lena observing the plate as if it were an anomalous specimen. When had she last been presented something without a transactional cost? When was sustenance not acquired from an automated dispenser? "Consume," Adrian directed, his tone mild but absolute. He mirrored her action with his own fork, allowing the subject of her injuries to dissipate. So she complied. The initial taste was a physiological jolt that almost overwhelmed her. The second anchored her in the immediate timeline. By the third, her system began to accept the stimulus as non-threatening. For a brief interval, she allowed for the processing of a positive sensation. Adrian consumed his own meal at a slower pace, his observation of her constant but unobtrusive. They operated within a silent pact, enclosed by the diner's low ambient noise and the friction of metal on ceramic. She processed half the meal before her body reached its somatic limit. She set her fork down, ingesting water. Functionality improving? Adrian inquired. It was. The stenosis at the edge of her vision had receded. Her hands were stable. For the first time in 16 hours, she was not on the verge of systemic failure. I acknowledge your assistance. It is inconsequential. I believe my departure is necessary. A scan of her screen. 12:47 a.m. 13 communications from Ethan, each displaying escalating toxicity. The stable moment fractured. I must return to my residence. Adrian's gaze tracked hers, noting the instantaneous state shift. Is that location truly where you wish to be? He queried. Wish is not a factor in the equation. That is an evasive tactic, not an answer. Lena then conducted a true assessment of him. The tailored suit failing to conceal a core of steel, the eyes that held their own violent case history. Who are you? She demanded. Specifically, you are not a random environmental factor. Adrian paused. My designation is Adrian Valente, he stated. I am the proprietor of a private security firm. We neutralize high-risk threats for clients who must operate outside of official channels. Security, Lena repeated, the term feeling alien. The disclosure was simultaneously more and less than she had formulated. Asset protection on occasion? And your motive for revealing this is? Because you made an inquiry, and I do not deploy falsehoods with individuals I intend to assist. You intend to assist me? I do. Why? Because you require it, and because I am capable, and because... He stopped, his expression altering. Because long ago, I received aid from an individual with no obligation to provide it. I have been balancing that one account ever since. Lena's phone vibrated against the table. She could not look. To view Ethan's name would be to reanimate the antagonist awaiting her. Acknowledging the stimulus would extinguish the nascent flicker of autonomy she was cultivating. If I fail to return, she whispered, the negative consequences will escalate. Adrian's quiet query was incisive. Will they escalate, or will they merely be altered? He was proposing she had already reached rock bottom and was merely afraid of the adjacent room. From my clinical perspective, conditions do not deteriorate much further than concealing contusions and fainting on a subway from fear-induced starvation. Lena prepared to offer a counter-argument to list the variables his assessment was ignoring. But the vocalization was aborted because his diagnosis was 100% accurate. It was already at that stage. It had been for months. Her rationale was merely a choice between a known hostile environment and an unknowable future. I have no alternative destination, she whispered, the confession costing her the last of her psychological armor. Adrian produced his phone, sent a brief message, and received an immediate reply. I maintain a private apartment in Tribeca. It is a secure location, and it is unoccupied. He maintained eye contact, his expression unreadable. It is allocated to you for tonight and tomorrow. We will address subsequent variables later, but you're not returning to the location of your injuries. That protocol is terminated for tonight. Lena's heart rate accelerated. The moment felt dissociated from reality. She possessed no data to determine if this man was a rescuer or a more sophisticated predator. But she knew with absolute, cold certainty what waited at her Washington Heights location. She knew Ethan would be present, intoxicated, and searching for a target to externalize his life's failures onto. The word no was a viable response, yet what emerged was a quiet capitulation. Okay, Lena heard her own voice say. Okay for the duration of the night. A single sharp nod from Adrian finalized the agreement. He placed a thick stack of currency on the table and stood. Lena followed, powered by the newly processed calories. A low-grade tremor still propagated through her limbs as she collected her belongings. Adrian held the door, and she took a deep inhalation before entering the night. A vehicle was positioned there, Marcus at the controls, as if such extractions were a routine procedure. In Adrian's operational theater, they likely were. Tribeca apartment, Adrian instructed as they entered the rear cabin. The high-security one. Acknowledged. The 20-minute transit was silent, a passage from the city's raw periphery to its secured center. Lena stared outward, her phone a dead weight in her pocket. She finally deactivated her phone's notification system. Whatever rage Ethan was discharging, she would not serve as its audience. Not for this duration, and perhaps never again. They arrived at a structure that exuded generational wealth, a discreet entry, a doorman who recognized Adria, and a lobby suitable for a design publication. Mr. Valente informed the concierge that Miss Carter would occupy 12B and was to be granted all professional courtesies. The doorman, James, remained perfectly composed. Of course, Mr. Valente. Welcome, Miss Carter. The elevator was a polished glass enclosure that ascended with a silent, unnerving velocity. It rose without a sound while Lena's viscera clenched from something other than momentum. The 12th floor doors opened onto a hallway so meticulously designed it felt like a projection of power. It was a domain of controlled palettes, authenticated art, and strategically deployed light and shadow. Adrian halted at the second door on the left, deactivating the lock with a key card. A soft tone, a heavy mechanical sound. The door opened to reveal a volume of space that made her own dwelling seem like a storage unit. It was an open-plan layout with a large kitchen and a living space filled with elegant, functional objects. Expansive windows displayed a city panorama that was valued higher per square foot than most annual incomes. Sleeping quarters are down that corridor, Adrian indicated. Private sanitation facilities, fresh linens, a supplied pantry. Treat it as your own territory. I can arrange for clothing delivery tomorrow, should you require it. Lena remained immobile, stunned by the sheer scale of the environment, feeling like an organism out of its natural habitat. This is a dissociative event, she breathed. He replied, a secure perimeter is not an aberration, it is a baseline requirement. I lack the resources to compensate you for this. He countered, you will not be invoiced. Then what is your objective? The question was sharp, a product of a life where altruism was always a transactional tactic. Adrian observed her for a long moment, then produced a card and wrote on it. That is my direct contact number. Use it 24/7 for any contingency. He paused. My objective is your physical safety. That is the complete parameter. No additional terms. Simply rest without the need for hypervigilance. As he turned to depart, a sudden anxiety took hold of her. Wait, she said. What if he... She could not articulate the scenario. Adrian verbalized it for her. What if he locates you? He will not. This building's security is impenetrable. But for your own psychological comfort, a panic button by the bed is linked to my cell and building security simultaneously. Activate it, and a response team will be at this door in under 2 minutes. The realization struck her. You have executed this protocol before. He gave a single nod. Why? A trace of an old trauma appeared on his face. Because I understand the feeling of having no options, and of someone materializing one from nothing. Before she could formulate another query, he had withdrawn, the door closing with a soft, definitive sound. Lena was left alone in the absolute silence, her mind processing conflicting data streams. 1 hour ago, a subway station, now a stranger's penthouse. The new paradigm felt like a lucid dream. The phone vibrated with a final, insistent demand. 22 messages. She retrieved it, and the sight of Ethan's name was a stress fracture through her resolve. Silence was an insufficient countermeasure. This needed a clean excision. Her thumb depressed the button. A slow-motion termination until the screen went black, severing the digital leash he kept on her psyche. From the window, Lena observed the Manhattan skyline, a glittering tableau indifferent to her psychological confinement. Below, Ethan, the primary architect of her condition, was undoubtedly enacting his own possessive psychodrama, expecting a capitulation she would no longer provide. Against the cold glass, her emotional fortifications gave way, permitting the first cathartic release in 8 months of profound distress. This was no quiet sorrow, but a deep, somatic expulsion, a forcible exorcism of the chronic terror she had internalized. She clung to the tenuous hypothesis that this reprieve was genuine, that benevolence was not merely a narrative construct, and that a stranger's focused gaze could represent a legitimate sanctuary. Lena awoke to a novel quality of light. Not the familiar oppressive gray of her prior existence, but a lucid, golden hue that suffused the room like a therapeutic intervention. For 3 heartbeats, she remained in a state of dissociative calm before the full psychic weight of the previous night's events descended. Memory fragments materialized. The transit platform, Adrienne's sudden appearance, the diner, and the pivotal decision to sever ties with her former residence. Her phone on the nightstand was a dormant trigger. The morning light revealed the room's improbable opulence, with linens valued higher than her monthly income. The furniture held a silent, authoritative quality, sourced from establishments where price displays were deemed uncivilized. This aesthetic extended to the living space, where the morning sun seemed to activate the costly objects, transforming them into mute observers of her presence. The gravity of her actions manifested as Lena sat upright, initiating a cascade of somatic pain. While the psychological exhaustion had abated, a physical record of her trauma remained. Bruised ribs protested each respiration. The contusion from Ethan's ring was a livid mark on her skin, and her muscles ached with the memory of constant duress. The clock displayed 9:47 a.m., denoting nearly 9 hours of unconsciousness, a level of restorative sleep absent from her recent memory. Her backpack, the repository of her former life, contained scrubs, 3 granola bars, a book, and an E tied to a domicile that was no longer a safe zone. Her entire material value was held within that single bag. This fact, which should have been crippling, instead produced a feeling of radical detachment. She was liberated from anything she could not abandon. The definitive psychological separation, however, had initiated the moment she entered Adrienne's vehicle. A raw, biological imperative for sustenance pulled her from her cognitive vortex. Adrienne had indicated a well-stocked kitchen. She emerged in his oversized t-shirt, his expensive cologne, a sensory trace of the fabric, and found his description to be a significant understatement. The refrigerator was a monument to stability. Crisp produce, fresh eggs, milk with a remarkably distant expiration date, and dense blocks of cheese. The freezer contained premium cuts of meat and artisanal ice cream. Lena observed this, experiencing an internal tremor. When had a meal last been a choice rather than a survival calculation? She prepared eggs and cheese, made toast with butter, and drank juice that tasted of fresh fruit. Seated in this stranger's residence, wearing his clothes and eating his food, she was overcome by the acute sensation of imposter syndrome. His business card was on the counter, its heavy linen texture suggesting permanence. Valente Security Solutions. On the back, his personal cell number was written in a controlled, precise hand. She handled it, feeling the burden of an unspoken debt for this asylum. She possessed no contingency plan. Her sole strategy had been a desperate hope to never encounter Ethan again. Before the fear could recrystallize, she reactivated her phone. The screen erupted in a digital assault. The metrics rose: 37 texts, 15 missed calls, 8 voicemails, all from the perpetrator. The subject, exhibiting somatic tremors, accessed the digital communications. A pronounced flight response was overridden by a compulsion to analyze the profile of the perpetrator from whom she had escaped. Initial messages mimicked concern, a charade that devolved into possessive diatribes, accusations, and direct commands. Threats of retribution were followed, at approximately 0200 hours, by disingenuous apologies, a familiar de-escalation tactic. By 0400, the perpetrator's paranoia re-escalated, warping the threats. The final transmission, logged at 7:23, presented a chilling declaration of perceived ownership. "I know you'll be back. You always do, because you have nowhere else to go." His words were deployed with surgical precision. Lena let the phone fall, leaving the audio messages unheard. The food in her stomach became a cold, dense mass. His assessment was correct, wasn't it? This apartment, Adrian's intervention, it was a brief functional delusion. The objective world, with its cruel logic, was waiting. She had no resources, no allies, her entire support network having been systematically dismantled to placate Ethan's pathology. Her phone vibrated again. An unrecognized number, an impulse she couldn't rationalize, compelled her to answer. "Miss Carter?" a detached professional voice asked. "Yes." The caller identified himself as James from the front desk, reporting that an Ethan Morris was in the lobby, insisting on seeing her. He was expressing total certainty of her presence in the building. A cold dread, a classic fear response, permeated Lena's circulatory system. James confirmed access was denied, but the individual was refusing to leave. "I wanted to inform you before we involved the authorities." "What?" Lena's voice was a constricted thread of sound. "How did he locate me?" "I cannot speculate, ma'am. Shall I have him removed?" "Yes, at once." Her cognitive functions fractured. "Tell him nothing, only that he has the incorrect address." "It will be handled with discretion." The connection ended. Lena remained immobilized, overcome by a pure, unmitigated terror. How was he aware? She had informed no one. Then the nauseating realization occurred. The phone, the Life 360 surveillance application he had coerced her into installing months prior, framed as a tool for her safety. She had forgotten the digital tether he employed to monitor her movements. With unsteady fingers, Lena found the spyware, uninstalled the application, and purged her settings of all location-based services. It was the primary action she should have taken, but in the haze of her exhaustion, needing just one night of psychological quiet, she had neglected her digital signature. A firm knock at the door sent a violent shockwave through her nervous system. "Miss Carter, it is James with a delivery." She approached the door like an automaton, verifying through the peephole that he was alone, holding a box. She opened the door, the security chain a fragile boundary. "My apologies for the disturbance," James stated, his formal tone mitigated by an expression of authentic concern. Mr. Morris was escorted off the property and is now barred from entry. Mr. Valente was notified and is en route. He contacted you. The suite's security protocol notifies designated contacts of any incident. Mr. Valente stated he would address this matter personally. James offered the package. He also instructed me to give this to you. Lena accepted the box, uttered her thanks, and observed his departure. She engaged the deadbolt and leaned against the door, her respiration shallow. The box held a new high-specification phone. A note from Adrian was enclosed, untraceable, new number. Assume your old device is compromised. His foresight was as unnerving as it was reassuring. Another knock. This time, the peephole revealed Adrian's face. He was dressed in dark jeans and a sweater, his casual attire failing to conceal an aura of controlled authority. As she opened the door, his gaze performed a rapid, clinical scan of her condition. Are you unharmed? How did you know about Ethan? About this situation? James alerted me regarding the individual downstairs. After last night, I made a logical inference. He entered with the practiced movement of someone accustomed to assessing environments for threats. May I? He asked, crossing to the window to survey the street. He is gone. Security informed him a second attempt would lead to his arrest. We have also initiated a formal harassment complaint. You cannot do that, she objected. It will only escalate his aggression. You are correct. I do not know him, Adrian conceded, turning from the window. But I recognize the archetype. They depend on their target's belief that escape is impossible. The moment you cease exhibiting victim behavior, their power diminishes. You don't understand. He will always discover another method. Not into this location, Adrian stated, his voice containing a chilling certitude. This building is a fortress, outfitted with systems unknown to most. Facial recognition, biometric access, total surveillance. He is physically precluded from this space. Lena resisted the seductive logic of his words. She wanted to trust in his technological solutions, but her history with Ethan demonstrated that physical deterrents were merely a challenge to a fixated mind. He knows I am in this vicinity, she whispered. He tracked me once. He will simply wait for me to emerge. Then you will not emerge. Not for now. Adrian moved to the kitchen and began preparing coffee with an innate mastery of the space. Take several days. Permit me to resolve this. Resolve it how? Through established legal means. I retain a firm that specializes in this specific type of predator. They possess an unequaled record of success. I have no funds for legal counsel. Adrian filled 2 mugs, adding cream to both without asking, a gesture of quiet observation. I am not requesting payment from you. You can't simply... Lena's voice failed, the words lost to her disbelief. Why are you doing this? We are strangers. You were an individual in distress. Adrian offered her a mug, a warm, solid object amidst the chaos. They stood in the kitchen's quiet refuge, drinking coffee as the city operated 12 floors below. Lena's mind was a maelstrom of negative outcome simulations. Adrian remained within the silence, an unmovable presence. At last she articulated the question that had formed in the wreckage of her life. Tell me about the defining hardship from your past, the event you mentioned. The subject's silence registered like a palpable absence. At 17, my group and I were involved in underground dealings. I was driven by youthful arrogance, with a worldview sharply divided between those who pursued and those who were pursued. his focus fixated on the vortex within his cup. A critical error in judgment resulted in my own scheduled termination. An external agent, however, presented an alternative identity construct. Your selection? To become the intervening agent. His gaze established dominance. My entire enterprise is founded upon this single precept. Our function is protective insulation for the isolated. The client profile ranges from executives targeted by unseen threats to witnesses requiring total erasure. His gesture encompassed the environment. Occasionally, the subject is a medical professional incapacitated by acute anxiety. I am not your patient. A correct assessment, Adrienne affirmed. You retain autonomy. I am merely the facilitator. The legacy device vibrated, an electronic tether to her tormentor, Ethan. She averted her gaze. I have commitments, she stated. My duties commence at 3. Notify them of your unavailability. The financial loss is prohibitive. No longer. A 24-hour strategic window is your newest asset. The rationale was an irrefutable construct. The subject, Lena, processed the stark logic of his statement. A cessation of work equated to lost income, a critical blow to her fragile stability. Adrienne appeared to perceive her cognitive distress. State your net compensation for 1 work period. That is not relevant. Respond to the query. Post deductions approximately $200. Acknowledged. Adrienne retrieved his wallet, extracting currency. $400. He placed it on the counter. This covers 2 work periods. Use the time for recuperation. I will manage the legal offensive. On Monday, you will re-enter your workplace under judicial protection. Lena's gaze remained locked on the funds. This is not acceptable. The transaction is complete. The payment is before you. This behavior is anomalous. It deviates from social norms. I am an outlier. I am an individual for whom $400 is trivial. You are an individual for whom self-respect is a non-essential. This psychological dissection dismantled her remaining defenses. He had accurately diagnosed her facade of autonomy. She exhibited classic signs of desperation for security and a release from prolonged hypervigilance. What mechanism prevents my absconding with the funds? The query was involuntary. A fleeting, almost imperceptible shift in his expression suggested amusement. Such an act would violate your core psychological profile, he stated. If my assessment were incorrect, the expenditure would be logged as a justifiable loss. Lena's digits made contact with the currency, manipulated it, then returned it. The conflict was clear, a cognitive dissonance between trust and the expectation of quid pro quo. Adrienne consumed his beverage and cleansed the vessel. Comprehension of the mechanism is not required, only submission to its process. He departed, promising communication. Isolated, Lena attempted to process the preceding 12 hours. Her prior existence manifested as a state of learned helplessness with no perceived escape routes. Her current environment was a Tribeca penthouse with superior coffee, $400, and the assurance of a stranger's intervention. The experience mimicked a hallucinatory state. Yet sensory input, the beverage, the currency, the somatic pain from a recent contusion confirmed its veracity. The external threat, Ethan, remained active but geographically contained, not within this sanctuary. Following 8 months of sustained psychological distress, she had secured a defensible position. She initiated the new communication device, a symbolic reset, the potential for an existence free from the abuser's emotional volatility. The device requested a security code. Following a brief pause, She input 6 digits. November 27th, the date marking her psychological rebirth. The legacy device activated, the abuser's identifier appeared. The decision point was now terminal. She opened the window, observing the 12-story drop, and released the object. It descended, disintegrating upon impact. A subtle smile formed as she secured the window with a firm click. 3 days elapsed in a state of cognitive disorientation. Adrian's communications were systematic. Legal orders filed, threats documented. Law enforcement had engaged Ethan. The subject, Lena, began the process of autonomic nervous system regulation. The 4th day necessitated a return to her employment. Marcus served as her transport, a non-negotiable directive from Adrian. He delivered her at 14:45. Lena experienced depersonalization, a sense of disembodiment. "My post-shift presence is confirmed," Marcus stated. "That protocol is superfluous." The directive was explicit. She ceased to object. Adrian issued mandates, not recommendations. Resistance was futile. The emergency department presented its typical tableau of controlled crisis. 3 penetrating traumas, 2 toxicological emergencies, a severe hand injury, and a disturbance in Bay 6. In essence, a standard Tuesday. "Carter." The voice belonged to Linda, her superior. "You have returned. Is your status nominal?" "Affirmative. Thank you for arranging the coverage." "A notification window exceeding 2 hours is preferred." Linda's tone was procedural, not punitive. "Unscheduled absences create logistical strain. Acknowledged. The error was mine. It will not be repeated." An admission of fault was a more palatable narrative than disclosing her flight from a violent partner. The perception of unreliability was preferable to the stigma of victimhood. Her work cycle resumed its typical high-stress cadence. A continuous sensory assault of electronic alerts and intravenous drips, underlaid by pervasive human suffering. 5 hours into the period, she detected it. A focused, predatory gaze. A primal threat detection system activated. She raised her head. He was present in the reception area. Ethan. Her respiration ceased, a violation of all established parameters. The judicial order rendered his proximity illegal. Nevertheless, he remained 40 feet distant, his expression a clear, nonverbal threat. A tremor manifested in her extremities, causing her to drop a writing instrument. Jennifer, a junior colleague, noted her fixed gaze. "Is that an acquaintance? He has been loitering for an hour. Security nearly removed him, but he claimed to be awaiting an associate." "Summon them," Lena articulated faintly. "Immediately." Jennifer's demeanor transitioned to alarm. "Oh God, is he—" She reached for the telephone, but Lena was immobilized, psychologically transfixed by his stare. She observed his facial muscles tighten as he deduced her action. He attempted egress, but security personnel were more rapid. 2 guards intercepted him. Their verbal exchange was inaudible, but his body language shifted, instantly adopting the posture of the aggrieved. He produced his phone, prepared to document his manufactured victimhood. She observed his controlled removal. He delivered a final glance, his gaze locking with hers as he articulated a silent threat. "This is not concluded." He was then escorted away. She remained static as Linda approached. "Are you harmed?" "That individual. I possess a judicial order of protection against him." "Understood." Linda's expression became rigid. "To my office, immediately." The space was compact and file-choked. Linda placed a document on her desk. "This is procedural. A report is filed for persons under restraining orders. Security receives his photograph. A recurrence triggers an immediate police response. She pushed the form toward her. Complete this. And Lena, your security is paramount. Any escalation presents a significant institutional liability. The situation is secure, Lena maintained, though somatic tremors contradicted her. My residence is fortified. It is contained. Is it? Linda's skepticism was evident. From my perspective, this appears to be an initial stage. Cognitively, she knew Linda's assessment was accurate. The remainder of her shift was a disoriented state of heightened adrenaline. Auditory stimuli triggered a startle reflex. At 23:30, Marcus arrived, and she entered the vehicle in a state of collapse. Was there an event? He inquired, his gaze meeting hers via the mirror. He located me, at my place of employment. Marcus immediately dispatched a text message. 30 seconds later, her device vibrated with Adriana's directive. Transport her to the apartment. I am terminating this situation. The meaning was ambiguous. Her cognitive and physical exhaustion precluded analysis, and she lapsed into unconsciousness. Adrian was present at the residence. He assessed her condition, comprehending the situation without verbal input, and closed his laptop. Recount the event in its entirety. She complied. The details of the encounter were expelled. The nonverbal threats, the security intervention, and the certainty that Ethan's campaign had just begun. Following her narrative, a profound silence ensued. This conflict concludes tomorrow. You cannot assure that outcome. Observe. He initiated a call. Leo, I require a comprehensive dossier on an Ethan Morris. All data, legal infractions, financial records, professional history, interpersonal relationships. The deadline is sunrise. He dismissed financial inquiries, his attention becoming hyper-focused on the subject. He detailed the predator's modus operandi, leveraging obscurity and psychological intimidation. Fear, he lectured, is an instrument effective only on the disempowered. Her query regarding strategy was answered with his core objective: to restore her lost autonomy. By sunrise, the target's entire digital footprint would be excavated and exposed. The strategy was to levy a penalty of such magnitude that it would be cognitively overwhelming for the target. A rational observer might recoil from his detached proficiency in this digital deconstruction. He was unequivocally an authority in this clandestine domain. Her predominant emotional response was, paradoxically, profound relief. In Adrian, she perceived a protector figure, one possessing the placid affect of an individual familiar with severe distress. When she broached the subject of remuneration for his services, he dismissed the notion, his gaze breaking from a screen only to finalize his refusal. He remained adamant. His assistance was unconditional, a foundational tenet of his practice. Upon her insistence for further clarification, he closed the laptop. His enterprise, while serving an affluent clientele, was founded on the memory of his own adolescent vulnerability at 17. Consequently, he accepts one pro bono case monthly. She was the current selection. She displayed a defensive reaction, perceiving herself as an object of charity, an idea he quickly dispelled. Her physical safety was the sole operative principle, the case file a mere formality. The core function, he noted, was a matter of fundamental empathy. For repayment, he suggested a donation to a women's shelter. An alternative, he stated, was to assist the next individual in a similar crisis. A philosophy of proactive altruism that served as his guiding principle. Lena observed him, theorizing the ideological factors that would compel a man to become a perpetual guardian for the vulnerable against aggressors. She inquired directly about his own protector figure during his youth. His affect shifted to a guarded expression as he recounted Marie, an operator of a Bronx youth center. He had arrived at her facility one night with physical injuries, and she had administered first aid, asserting his intrinsic value beyond a violent end on the streets. A palpable, nonverbal interval occurred between them. Marie had succumbed to a malignancy 6 years prior, precluding any formal expression of his gratitude. When Lena queried if this was his primary motivation, he confirmed it was a component. The rest, he claimed, was for self-actualization. Aiding others provided a rationalization for his own early life trauma. Lena moved to his position by the window. Below, the metropolis functioned as a macrocosm of innumerable private conflicts. She contemplated how many others were sequestered in unfamiliar environments, protected by strangers, hoping for survival. "Thank you," she articulated, acknowledging he had no formal obligation to her. He countered that he felt a compulsion to intervene, framing his action as rescuing her not from an individual, but from a state of psychic death. Their eye contact established a non-verbal rapport between two individuals with a shared lexicon of trauma. He then advised her to rest. The following day, he warned, would be a period of intense conflict. After his departure, Lena remained in the secure, opulent residence, processing a nascent sense of optimism. She performed basic hygiene, donned the simple attire he left, and entered a deep, restorative sleep state. For the first time in 8 months, her sleep was not invaded by trauma-related nightmares or auditory hallucinations of Ethan's voice. Instead, her dream content involved a symbolic rescue from a fall at a train station. The subsequent walk to the courthouse was subjectively perceived as a procession toward her own demise. Lena's footsteps resonated on floors that had served as the backdrop for countless lives deconstructed and reassembled. The judicial system was a focus of intense ambivalence for her. 3 months had elapsed since Adrian's team initiated the order, and 3 months since the prosecutor had acted upon her medical records. It had been 90 days of hearings and opaque legal terminology, a protracted and psychologically taxing process. Her sense of security felt contingent and transient. Adrian, present beside her, had suspended all other professional obligations to be there that morning. At 7 a.m., Adrian had suggested a strategy for postponement, a method to delay the direct confrontation. Lena, however, was already attired in her psychological armor for the event, a blazer he had supplied. In the mirror, she observed a persona fortified for conflict. She declined his tactical delay, reasoning it would only amplify her anticipatory anxiety. His concern was evident, but she met his gaze with the newly manifested, dispassionate resolve. He had meticulously observed her need for personal space during her recovery, and his residence had become her secure environment. Her personal effects had gradually appeared, indicating she had integrated her presence into his private domain. The subject of their future, once the immediate crisis was resolved, remained a mutually avoided topic. Neither possessed the psychological readiness to address the volatile issue. One does not plan for post-conflict conditions while navigating a high-threat environment. She insisted on proceeding, not for legal validation, but for her own psychological closure. Her stated goal was to view him and achieve complete emotional neutrality. Informed by his own past, Adrian nodded slowly in assent. A silent rapport was established between them. It was an implicit pact between her and the individual who had intervened in her crisis. They were two survivors attempting to process their respective traumas. The courtroom was an unexpectedly mundane setting, less a judicial theater than an academic hall. Then she made visual contact with Ethan at the defendant's table. He was seated next to a public defender, exhibiting signs of fatigue. Incarceration had markedly altered his presentation. His head was shorn, and the pigment of his uniform gave his skin a pallid quality. The moment Lena entered, he executed a reflexive, rapid head turn in her direction. Their gazes locked across 20 feet of palpable tension. She maintained eye contact, refusing to be the first to disengage. This was the initial psychological confrontation, a move to reclaim the agency he had systematically eroded for 8 months. The prosecutor, Patricia Reeves, escorted Lena to the front row. Adrian occupied the adjacent seat, his presence a stabilizing influence and a nonverbal assurance of security. He was a psychological anchor against potential dissociation. As the judge appeared, the courtroom rose and the formal judicial process commenced. Lena attempted to suppress her somatic anxiety responses. The prosecution calls Lena Marie Carter. The physical act of rising required a monumental exertion of will. The walk to the witness stand became an experience of extreme temporal distortion, lasting seconds, but felt over a lifetime. Under the scrutiny of the room and the perceived intensity of Ethan's focus on her back, the bailiff administered the oath. Lena placed her hand on the Bible and committed to a truthful testimony, a simple act that could not encompass the fragmented, traumatic reality of the fear and shame that had nearly disintegrated her sense of self. Patricia Reeves approached, a file serving as a prop in the dramaturgical retelling of Lena's trauma for 12 strangers. Miss Carter, please relate to the court how you first met the defendant. Lena's throat felt constricted. She drank water, a 5-second pause to regulate her breathing. At a pub in Queens, approximately 2 years ago, she began. He initiated contact while I was with colleagues. She confirmed a relationship timeline of roughly 14 months prior to cohabitation. When did the pattern of abuse begin? Lena had rehearsed this testimony repeatedly, yet articulating it here, with Ethan just 10 feet away, created a sense of semantic dissociation. It began about 3 months after I moved in. Initially, they were subtle control tactics, hostility if I was delayed from work, persistent accusations, monitoring my phone. His questioning was a constant interrogation. She paused. Then, one evening, I publicly corrected a narrative he was sharing. After his friends departed, he initiated physical violence. Describe this event for the court. This was the component she dreaded, verbalizing the raw assault to an audience incapable of comprehending the subjective terror. Into my abdomen. He stated I had publicly humiliated him, that I was required to learn a submissive role. Her vocal affect was blunted, a deliberate calmness intended to project credibility. Subsequently, the triggers for aggression became unpredictable. A meal, tardiness, a misperceived glance, my mere presence when he required a cathartic outlet. Did you attempt to seek external help? This was a pivotal inquiry. Lena described 2 visits to the emergency room, for which she provided fabricated explanations about falling. She then made direct eye contact with the prosecutor. I'm a nurse, she stated. I am trained to recognize all the indicators. However, cognitive awareness of a threat and the capacity to escape it are 2 distinct functions. Patricia offered a slight nod. Let us address the night of August 17th. The date was a significant trauma marker in her memory. Lena drank more water, allowing the toxic recollections she had suppressed for 3 months to resurface. She recalled a 16-hour shift, profound fatigue, and the anxiety associated with returning home. Her gaze passed over the jury, 7 women and 5 men, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and skepticism. She recounted purchasing his preferred beer, a futile de-escalation tactic. It had no effect. He was already intoxicated, operating under a paranoid delusion of her infidelity at the hospital. As she tried to impede his path, he applied manual pressure to her throat, and her body's impact with the wall produced a low-frequency thud. A collective sharp inhalation was audible from the gallery. Lena's composure was a fragile construct. He maintained his grip, her vision constricting to a gray haze before he released her, and she collapsed, losing motor control. On the ground, he delivered 2 distinct blows to her ribs with his foot. He then whispered a threat of annihilation should she defy him again. Her narrative voice remained chillingly detached, and I believed he was capable of it. Thereafter, her survival strategy became one of calculated avoidance. She waited until his agitated state gave way to sleep, gathered minimal belongings, and fled into the city. She worked a 16-hour shift, followed by another. Her existence became a meticulously planned evasion, returning to the apartment for supplies only during brief windows of his absence. She used the hospital, her vehicle, and the perpetual movement of the subway as transient safe zones, a state where constant motion became her primary defense mechanism against capture. The attorney's query frames departure as a simple, unexercised option. "I had nowhere else to be," she responds, her affect flat. Her residence, career, and finances had been systematically interwoven into an instrument of coercive control. The life she inhabited was a psychological prison he had constructed around her with clinical precision. A fissure appears in her stoic presentation. "And he promised he would hunt me down. He swore he would do things to me I couldn't even imagine." Her certainty is palpable. Patricia lets the gravity of this credible threat permeate the room, ensnaring the jury in that same fear. "Miss Carter, when did you perceive an opportunity to escape?" "The night I experienced a syncopal episode on the train." Lena delineates the topography of her terror, the oppressive weight of the work shifts, the chronic state of malnutrition, the anxiety that became her baseline state. She recounts her collapse and the intervention of a stranger, a man who recognized her conditioned responses. He provided sustenance and a secure environment, the first she had known in a significant period. She avoids Adrian's gaze, but his observation is a palpable, heavy presence. And subsequently, did the defendant attempt to initiate contact? "He did," she affirms. Her mobile phone was repurposed into a vector for his escalating narcissistic rage. He appeared at her hospital, attempting to intimidate her colleagues. When a court order formed a legal barrier, he weaponized mutual contacts to convey threats of retribution for the shame she had inflicted upon him. Patricia then presents a cell phone. "Miss Carter, is this your device?" "Yes." "And were those communications sent by the defendant?" Lena observes the screen. The defendant's venom, now sterile in black and white text, feels like a distorted facsimile of the cold dread it induced at 2 a.m. "Yes, they were. Would you please read message number 14 for the court?" Lena's throat constricts, a somatic response to trauma recall. She recognizes this specific text, the one that had catalyzed the district attorney's intervention. "You worthless slut! You think you can run from me? Hide behind that rich boy and his piece of paper. I will find you. I am going to ruin you in ways you can't even dream of. And then the world will finally see what a lying whore you are." The statements hung in the courtroom's dense silence. Lena observed the jurors' discomfort, the judge's expression hardening. Even the defendant's own counsel seemed unsettled. "Thank you, Miss Carter. No further questions." The defense attorney rises. Her bearing is that of a junior counsel assigned an unwinnable case, a task focused purely on mitigating the inevitable damage. Lena feels an unexpected trace of empathy for her. "Miss Carter, You are a registered nurse, correct? Yes. So you possess training in identifying the indicators of domestic violence? I do. You understood the protocols. You knew the resources for assistance. You were cognizant of your ability to contact law enforcement. The statement was an accusation disguised as a question, but Lena answers it. Knowing a lifeboat exists and being able to reach it while being forcibly held underwater are two disparate circumstances. But you did ultimately receive aid from Mr. Valente. Counsel directs a meaningful look toward Adrian, a man of substantial resources who provided you with lodging, legal representation, and funds. Is it not simply that you identified a more advantageous situation and seized it? Patricia is on her feet. Objection! Counsel is attempting to reframe the victim's rescue as a transaction. Sustained. Continue, counselor. The attorney shifts her line of attack. Miss Carter, you remained with my client for 8 months after this purported abuse commenced. You had opportunities to leave, yet you did not. Could those not have been instances of mutual altercations? Conflicts where physicality was expressed by both parties? In her lap, Lena's hands formed tight fists. This was the narrative she had anticipated, one that recasts her as a co-participant in the violence, reframing his brutality as the passion of a tumultuous relationship. No, she states, her voice sharp. I never initiated physical contact. I never issued threats. He was never in fear of me. This was not a conflict between equals. This was a case of him inflicting harm upon me for the sole reason that he could. And yet there are no witnesses to these events, no police reports from that period. It is merely your narrative against his. I have medical records from 2 distinct hospitalizations. I have photographic evidence of contusions. I have his text messages threatening my life. And, Lena inhales, I have the reality that I am here, under oath, in a public forum, aware this will affect me indefinitely. No one endures this process for attention. They endure it because it occurred and because they are no longer willing to be silent. The defense lawyer seeks an objection she knows is unavailable. She offers a small nod and returns to her seat. The judge calls a recess. As Lena descends from the witness stand, she feels a profound lack of motor control in her legs. Adrian is there instantly, and this time she accepts his hand, allowing him to stabilize her for the next phase. Your testimony was exceptionally compelling, he says quietly. I believe I may be nauseated. That is an entirely normative response. Come, you require fresh air. They locate a secluded bench away from the courthouse's frenetic energy, where destinies were being decided in muted discussions. Lena lowers her head, combating the visceral sickness that arises from the public exhibition of one's trauma. Adrian refrains from offering empty reassurances. He simply remains, his hand a grounding pressure on her back, a silent anchor. Do you believe it had an impact? Lena finally queries. I believe you presented your subjective truth, he replies. It is the only action any of us can take. It feels insufficient. It always does, but it was far more than he was prepared to offer you. Lena slowly straightens her posture. Down the hall, she sees Ethan being escorted to a holding cell, his face set in the familiar mask of rage that once induced cardiac distress in her. Now it merely evokes a sense of profound exhaustion. What is the contingency if he is acquitted? She asks, her voice low. Then your security becomes a non-negotiable imperative. That is the final word. The protective order becomes permanent. Your security detail remains with you at all times. You will never again be forced into a solitary encounter with him. And if he is convicted, then he serves his sentence, and you commence the process of discovering your identity when you are not living under his psychological shadow. That second possibility felt cognitively dissonant, a scenario where justice functions as intended. Then again, 3 months prior, the concept of safety had felt like a delusion, as had consuming a meal without anxiety or achieving a full night's sleep. Those impossible states had gradually become her baseline reality, reconstructed incrementally. They were recalled to the courtroom. The closing arguments registered as indistinct background noise. Patricia presented a methodical summary of the evidence, which the defense countered with a feeble attempt to introduce ambiguity. The jury then exited. The judge advised that court would reconvene for the verdict. The subsequent 4 hours were a singular form of psychological torment which Lena weathered in an anteroom with Patricia, Adrian, and his 2 security personnel. Food was delivered and went untouched. Coffee cooled. Lena attempted to divert her focus to a book, to her phone, any stimulus to interrupt the looping, intrusive thoughts of Ethan being released, appearing at her job, at her home. Just reappearing, with the same rage now honed by his period of confinement. A knock at the door from a bailiff announced the jury's return, and Lena's heart rate escalated sharply. The courtroom felt colder, or perhaps the chill was internal. She resumed her seat and observed as 12 individuals returned to the jury box, their expressions carefully neutral. The foreman rises, a man with spectacles who appeared to be a meticulous record keeper. He held a document containing the architecture of Lena's future, reduced to a single word. On the charge of assault in the 2nd degree, what is your finding? Guilty, the air expelled from Lena's lungs. On aggravated harassment. Guilty, on the charge of stalking, what is your finding? Guilty. 3 times. 3 institutional confirmations that her experience was not a fabrication, that it was valid. That Ethan's campaign against her was not a shared pathology or a deception she created. Someone behind her began to weep softly. Beside her, Adrian's hand located hers and held it firmly. It was a solid, warm anchor to the present. Lena's focus fixed on Ethan. He stared forward with a facade of indifference, but she noted the pronounced vascular pulse in his jaw, the exact tell that had always signaled an impending eruption. The judge scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks out. A bailiff escorted Ethan away. His lawyer began to pack her briefcase with the resignation of one who knew the engagement was lost from the start. Patricia turned to Lena and stated, "You are the agent of this outcome. This is the configuration of justice." Justice felt like a weariness that had infiltrated her bones, a surge of profound relief, and a peculiar void where the fear had been quartered. Lena could only manage a nod, words being inaccessible. As she left the courthouse, the sunlight on her skin felt like a form of absolution. It was spring in New York, and the city was blooming. Adrian had Marcus bring the car around, but Lena paused at the curb. "Can we just walk for a short distance?" she inquired. He studied her expression for a protracted moment. "Are you certain?" "I have a need for locomotion. I need to feel my own feet determining a path, rather than being governed by a judicial schedule." "Very well. What is our destination?" Lena looked down the vibrant street at the urban expanse before her. 3 months ago, her entire world was contained within a single backpack, propelled by pure terror. Now she had a residence that was beginning to feel like a home, her previous job reinstated, now that Ethan's threat was neutralized, and a man who had intervened in her free fall and asked for nothing but to see her stand on her own. "Nowhere in particular," she said, "just forward." and with that they began to walk. Adrian maintained a proximal orbit, ceding all control of their cadence and vector. Around them, the city's ordinary theater continued. Food vendors, flower stalls, the midday exodus of office personnel, and tourists disoriented by their maps. Here was a tableau of normative function, wholly unaware that a subject's personal universe had been fundamentally reorganized mere blocks away. I continue to await a feeling of objective reality. Lena's voice penetrated the urban drone. For what to feel real? The favorable outcome, the justice, any of it. I projected that after the verdict I would feel, I am uncertain, emancipated, triumphant, anything but this affective emptiness. Adrian paused, allowing the gravity of her words to be processed. A legal ruling cannot erase the past. It simply concludes a narrative chapter, providing the autonomy to compose the next. That is a remarkably astute insight for a protection agent. I possess diverse capabilities. Against all logic, an authentic smile manifested on Lena's face. A brief display of genuine humor, not the forced facsimile. This phenomenon was becoming more frequent. Small intervals where she ceased being hyper-vigilant or mournful and simply was. Their route culminated at Battery Park, a vantage point for observing the agitated harbor, the unending procession of visitors, and the steady transit of the ferries. Lena selected a bench, beginning the cognitive process of designing her future. It entailed returning to a dwelling conceived as a stronghold, but gradually becoming a home. It entailed resuming professional duties, free from the continuous, paranoid monitoring of her surroundings. She could at last envision a life defined by something beyond survival tactics, a future unencumbered by his psychopathic coercion. Perhaps she could now ascertain what she genuinely wanted, not merely what she was conditioned to tolerate. "Thank you," she articulated, her voice a quiet yet resilient element. Adrian merely regarded her. "For what?" "For extracting me from the trauma, for remaining, for making me feel of value when I had completely devalued myself. No, that was your own effort, Lena. I simply supplied a secure location for you to perform it. That is substantially more than most individuals are ever granted. That is a result of the entire protective framework being systemically compromised." A different sort of anger emerged in Adrian's inflection, one aimed externally, not toward her. "You were entitled to support. Then and now, no one should be compelled to navigate what you did in isolation." Lena initiated a tentative physical contact, resting her head on his shoulder. It was not uncomfortable. It was exactly as it appeared. Two subjects, bonded through crisis, now assessing if their unlikely connection could evolve into something more concrete. "So, what is the subsequent phase?" she inquired. "Sentencing is scheduled in 2 weeks. Following that, the protective order becomes permanent. Ethan is facing 3 years of incarceration, possibly 5, contingent on the judge." Adrian paused. "And you are free to reconstruct your life from its very foundation. What if I have no knowledge of how to start?" "Then you proceed methodically, one day at a time. There is no timetable for recovery." They stayed there until the sun set over Jersey and a coolness pervaded the air. Adrian contacted Marcus. The vehicle appeared with its characteristic unobtrusiveness. Their return to Tribeca was slow, impeded by the rush-hour traffic moving through the city's main channels. The instant Lena re-entered the apartment, the entire emotional topography of the space had been altered. Structurally, nothing had changed. Same items, same outlook, the same coffee machine she had finally learned to operate. But a profound internal transformation had taken place. This location was no longer merely a safe house. It was her domain, a territory she could either occupy or relinquish. It signified a choice, not an imprisonment. Adrian remained near the doorway. I should probably depart. Allow you some privacy. Stay, Lena stated with abruptness. The command carried such weight that she felt obligated to clarify, I cannot handle solitude tonight. I cannot bear the quiet, re-experiencing the trial, obsessing over the future, and debating if my fortitude was ever sufficient. Your fortitude was more than sufficient. Stay regardless. And so, he remained. They consumed Thai food from a local establishment Lena favored, eating from the containers while a generic cooking contest aired on television. An ideal sedative for the cognitive faculties. Adrian narrated an illogical anecdote about a security operation in Boston that had failed in a spectacular fashion. Lena reciprocated with an amusing story about a chronic patient at Sinai, an older woman who engaged in flirtatious behavior with male physicians and acted as the hospital's main conduit for information. It was a normal, unforced interaction, the type wholly separate from trauma, interventions, or the complex hero-victim paradigm that had characterized their relationship. At approximately 10 p.m., a deep wave of exhaustion finally overcame Lena. The trial's physiological stress response had fully subsided, revealing a vast, profound void. I need to sleep, she declared. I will remove myself from your space. You could remain. The words were uttered before she could suppress them. The sofa is adequate, or the guest room is unoccupied. She struggled to find the appropriate terminology. I do not want to awaken alone, not on this night. Adrian's expression relaxed with instant comprehension. Understood. The guest room it is. I will be available should you require assistance. Lena could only offer a nod. She understood she ought to say more, to perhaps address the abnormality of requesting a man to remain overnight when a primary kiss had not even been exchanged. Their entire bond occupied an unusual space between appreciation and a strong chemical attraction, further complicated by an element they had not yet identified. But she lacked the energy for a significant disclosure, too depleted for a thorough emotional analysis. She proceeded to her room and entered a state of immediate deep sleep, the non-dreaming type that occurs only after relinquishing a burden carried for months. When she regained consciousness 6 hours later to the muted morning light, her initial thought was not of anxiety, but of potential. The sentencing hearing set for 2 weeks after the verdict seemed like an addendum, the final credits after the primary narrative had concluded. Lena occupied the same courtroom on the same bench, yet the significant pressure on her chest was reduced. The case was resolved. This was simply the last administrative action, translating a guilty verdict into a period of incarceration. The judge was a woman in her 60s, utilizing reading glasses and exuding the distinct weariness that results from repeatedly observing humanity's worst behaviors. She examined the report, her expression neutral. Ethan was present in an orange jumpsuit, restrained, his face a deliberately composed mask of impassivity. His court-appointed lawyer made a perfunctory appeal for leniency, referencing an absence of prior convictions and a traumatic childhood, the typical narrative used to mitigate the severity of his specific form of aggression. In her counter-argument, Patricia Reeves submitted medical records, police filings that documented his violations of restraining orders, and text communications that demonstrated his escalating pattern of psychological warfare. She outlined the classic cycle of abuse, the statistical probability that Ethan would replicate his behavior with a different victim if not imprisoned, and the ethical necessity for a sentence that matched the crime's severity. The judge processed every word, her focus absolute. Then she looked at Ethan over her glasses. "Mr. Hayes, you have been adjudicated guilty on multiple charges of assault, harassment, and stalking. The evidence submitted shows a disturbing pattern of escalating aggression toward a person you claim to love. You used your physical superiority to exert control, to intimidate, and to cause injury to Miss Carter for months. When she found the strength to separate, you stalked her, continuing to threaten her life." Ethan's mandible tightened. Lena noted the contracting muscle, experiencing only a detached, clinical satisfaction that his physiological responses were at last being evaluated by an authority, and were failing that evaluation. "You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in a state penitentiary for assault, which will be followed by 2 years for stalking and harassment. The aggregate sentence is 7 years. With compliant behavior, parole could be considered in 5, the judge stated, her tone inflexible. Moreover, I am issuing a permanent order of protection. You are prohibited from making contact with Miss Carter by any means for the remainder of your life. A violation of this order will result in new criminal charges." "Do you understand the terms?" "Yes." The single word exited Ethan's mouth devoid of emotion, yet Lena registered the familiar intensity of his rage. That same fury once held her captive. Now it seemed merely pathetic. A developmentally arrested male oblivious to the fact that others were not simply characters in his personal melodrama. The bailiff escorted him away. Ethan did not look in her direction. She observed his departure, a narrative chapter closing with a finality that was both freeing and profoundly disquieting. 7 years. He would be 43 upon his release. She would be 35. 2 entirely separate individuals placed on divergent trajectories into a future she could not yet conceptualize. Outside, the April sun was intense, rendering her coat a superfluous encumbrance. Spring had taken hold, the city at last shedding winter's drab exterior. Patricia offered a brief professional embrace, the kind a lawyer gives a client for whom they have developed genuine respect. She promised to forward all judicial documents for Lena's archives. "So, what does the future hold for you?" Patricia inquired. Lena's gaze shifted to Adrian, who maintained a respectful distance but was ready to close the gap instantly. "I have no concrete plan. I suppose I will attempt to relearn normative behavior." "You have secured that right. Normal, mundane, whatever you term a life where you are not constantly assessing for threats behind you." Patricia performed a social departure ritual. "Maintain your well-being, Lena." "Affirmative." Marcus remained with the vehicle. Adrian facilitated her entry, a gesture she now reframed as protective instinct, not control. Upon seating, a noted release of accumulated somatic tension occurred. "What is our destination?" Adrian inquired, settling beside her. "Candidly, I lack that data. Home?" The descriptor for the loft remained alien, though its foreignness had decreased. The location was transitioning from a mere shelter. The subject was exhibiting nesting behaviors. Books now occupied a table, her preferred mug was present, and a plant on the ledge became her latest reclamation project. "Home," she confirmed, the concept itself a fragile psychological construct. Through the ambient city noise, Lena observed the passing environment, attempting to classify the novel emotion developing within her. It defied simple labels, presenting as a far more complex affective state. The feeling was analogous to standing at a precipice, aware of a necessary descent, but anticipating the thermal shock. Inside, Adrian prepared coffee while Lena shed her courtroom persona for casual attire, a gift from him, prompted by his assessment that her wardrobe was functionally inadequate. She had objected to its cost. He had invalidated the objection. This typified their dynamic, his consistent provision meeting her guarded reception, both parties maintaining a casual facade. She found him in the kitchen by 2 prepared mugs, his focus directed outward with his standard intensity. Lena possessed a learned proficiency in interpreting masculine silence, a skill developed during her association with Ethan. Yet Adrian's quiet was not the pre-storm stillness of a threat. It was the cognitive hum of a mind processing variables. "Are you operational?" she asked. "Is that not my line to you?" "I initiated. The query is mine." When Adrian turned, ambient light highlighted the fatigue etched into his features and the gray filaments in his hair. He appeared severely depleted. The subject experienced a sudden, powerful realization. She had never accurately computed the full cost of her security, the drain on his finances, his time, and his psychological stability. "I am reviewing subsequent protocols," he stated, inducing a visceral anxiety response in her. She anticipated the inevitable debriefing, where he would declare the objective met, her safety confirmed, and their professional association terminated. She had been mentally fortifying herself for this outcome. She had been systematically allocating her income, researching compact living quarters, and engineering her own exit strategy. "I need to state something," Adrian interjected, placing his mug down, "and I require you to listen to completion." "Understood," Lena's response was minimally audible. "These last months, with you present," he paused, selecting his words with methodical precision. "It has been a period of significant reassessment. You demonstrated that certain principles supersede any contract, that the preservation of one subject is the only meaningful work." Lena was cognitively dissonant. This preamble did not align with the termination script. He then presented the critical data. "I have an emotional attachment to you," Adrian said without qualification. "I have for some time. I remained silent due to the crisis, the power differential, and the inappropriateness of adding another stressor. But the crisis is resolved. The threat is neutralized. You are secure." His gaze was direct and steady. "So, I am disclosing this now when you have full autonomy to withdraw, that my attachment exceeds what is professionally logical for this duration of contact. And I must determine if any possibility of a reciprocal feeling exists." Lena's cardiac rhythm accelerated sharply. She set her mug down to prevent dropping it. "I cannot identify what I am feeling," she admitted with brutal honesty. "How can I be certain this is genuine and not a trauma bond?" "My judgment regarding male partners is impaired. I cannot differentiate between a stable man and a subsequent abuser." He nodded. "That is a valid clinical concern, but you occupy my thoughts. My sleep improves with the knowledge of your safety. You elicit a humor response in me, and you do not treat me like an objective. Also, my weekly planning now revolves around your professional schedule." She paused. "I cannot tell you if that is love or pathological dependence, but I recognize it as real." Adrian became perfectly still. "Then let us ascertain what it is, without pressure or deadlines." The offer was presented. Preserve professional boundaries or permanently dissolve them. It was an invitation to engage in normative social behavior. Meals, films, non-tactical dialogue, a controlled experiment to see what they could become post-conflict. What if an individual's core is fundamentally unstable? This was Lena's primary anxiety. Adrian did not offer a cure, but a shared burden. He inventoried his own pathologies: insomnia, a need for control, innate distrust, defining their connection by a mutual awareness of their respective damage. He produced a faint smile. We are both complex individuals. Perhaps we can be complex together. Lena experienced a moment of cognitive gestalt, where all the disparate data points of his behavior coalesced into a single, coherent picture. For instance, his knowledge of her coffee preparation, the literature from authors she had mentioned appearing unprompted, his non-possessive protection methods, always providing her with an escape vector. "I want to attempt it," she said. "I am terrified and likely unready, but I want to attempt it," he replied. "Fear indicates you are correctly assessing the situation. What if I cause you psychological damage? And what if you do not?" A laugh, a sound she did not recognize as her own, escaped Lena. "Is that your operating principle? Bet on the best case outcome?" "No, I plan for the worst and hope for the best." "But for you," Adrian said, closing the space between them, "I am willing to accept the risk." She closed the final inches separating them. The kiss was not a cinematic ideal. It was awkward and uncertain, their noses bumped. But it was authentic, and it was her decision. When they separated, Adrian's smile was genuine, his stoic facade having completely receded. "So," he stated, "dinner, a formal date. I know a venue with scallops that will recalibrate your sensory expectations." "Are you always this hyperbolic about food?" "Only when attempting to make a specific impression." So they proceeded. Lena wore a dress she had procured for herself. She felt stable, standing in footwear not designed for rapid egress. The establishment was discreet, but the host knew Adrian by name. Their conversation systematically excluded their shared trauma. He recounted his upbringing in Queens and his brother's homicide, the formative event that dictated his life's trajectory. Lena also disclosed her history in the foster system, the educators who recognized her potential, and the minor victory of a successful IV insertion. The sheer normalcy of the interaction was profound. On the walk back, Lena felt she could exist in the city without continuous threat mapping. Lena initiated physical contact, assessing the sensation of his hand in hers. It registered as familiar, like a long-standing habit. "May I ask you something?" she said. "Always." That night, on the train, why me? You could have engaged in the bystander effect like the others. Adrian remained silent for the duration of a city block. "You appeared," he finally responded, "like someone who had forgotten they had permission to fail. Like you had maintained structural integrity for so long that any weakness felt like a character defect." He paused. "I recognize that feeling of feigning substance when you are composed of dust. When I observed you, I saw my 17-year-old self, and it became impossible to disengage. I am profoundly glad you did not. As am I." They ascended the stairs to her apartment, each step an act of reclaiming territory. Inside, the space finally felt like a secure location. "Do you require my presence tonight?" Adrian asked, his tone low. "Or do you prefer solitude?" Lena analyzed the query, separating authentic need from conditioned obligation. "Stay," she concluded. "But in the guest room, I am not ready for increased intimacy." "That is entirely sufficient." In the subsequent weeks, a stable routine was established. Adrian would stay over, always in the separate room, a silent affirmation of her boundary. Their dates consisted of museums, cinemas, and a comedy club where Lena's laughter transitioned into a cathartic emotional release. They prepared meals together, debated the merits of an herb, and discovered a shared affinity for low-quality reality television. Lena re-engaged with therapy, on her own terms this time, beginning the arduous process of excavating her past with a clinician who respected her pace. They began to deconstruct 8 months of acute stress, a toxic 2-year attachment, and a childhood that conditioned her to view love as a precursor to abandonment. The work was slow and difficult, with progress only visible in retrospect, like viewing a chasm one has already crossed. For what felt like an eternity, she achieved a full sleep cycle without incident. She consumed food without fearing it would trigger Ethan's aggression. Her own agency was once again her own. At her job, a supervisor remarked on the change. "Whatever you are doing, Carter, continue. You resemble a human again, not a specter in the emergency room." A genuine laugh escaped Lena's lips. "Thank you, I suppose." "I'm serious. You are more present, more focused. I don't know what system rebooted in you, but it is effective." Everything had. Lena, however, attributed it to improved sleep. Then came June, transforming the city into a hot, humid environment. Adrian's climate-controlled apartment functioned as her sole safe zone. One Saturday found them in a state of lethargy, resolving a minor conflict by acquiring both desired outcomes. He broke the established quietude. A thought process has been initiated. Her retort was a defense mechanism, a hazardous activity. He dismissed this, asserting the topic's gravity. "I am conducting a foundational reassessment of my enterprise." Lena reoriented her body to face him, a nonverbal cue of full engagement. "The existing paradigm is being dismantled. I am shifting from corporate asset protection to safeguarding victims who cannot afford such services, survivors of abuse. We will provide refuge, legal capital, and tangible aid." Her assessment: "Adrian, this constitutes a radical restructuring. It is the sole remaining vocational pursuit with perceived value. Prior contracts have generated sufficient capital for long-term funding, and The pause was significant. "My encounter with you, it served as a catalyst for my original thesis. True protection is not asset guarding. It is providing a state of existence free from terror." Lena experienced a profound somatic response in her chest. "Your target demographic is my clinical profile. That is the objective, to construct the support system that was absent for you, preventing others from reaching a psychological breaking point on a subway platform, where survival depends on random intervention." Her attempt at levity: "As a business model, it appears flawed." Profit is not the motivating factor. Lena initiated prolonged physical intimacy, a communication that bypassed her verbal processing deficits. Upon separation, his focus was acute. "Cohabitate with me," he stated, the words delivered with the surgical precision. He then stipulated the terms: "As my partner, not as a subject requiring rescue." He dismissed logistical concerns as irrelevant, focusing on her underlying motivation. Her consent had to be an act of will, not a response to duress. Lena countered by presenting evidence of her own established autonomy. He was already aware of this, having observed the data trail of her self-liberation efforts. His appeal was for the therapeutic effect of her presence, for quotidian indicators that the acute crisis phase had passed. Lena's hesitation articulated the core clinical question: can a bond formed under extreme duress persist in a state of normalcy? His answer was a commitment to mutual adaptation through a shared process. He framed the proposition as a strategic risk taken to mitigate future regret, a logic she found compelling. Lena contrasted this with her default strategy, a life of fortified solitude, secure but devoid of stimulus. The conflict was classic. The known safety of isolation versus the perceived existential risk of attachment. She reached a critical insight. The state of being safe was not synonymous with the state of being content. This protocol is effective, she conceded, thus solidifying her decision. The intensity of his smile served as sufficient positive reinforcement. They marked the decision with a mundane act, a shared collapse that signaled a future of normative interactions. Lena awoke at 0300 hours, disoriented, experiencing somatic tremors originating from a psychic trauma. The impulse to revert to established defense mechanisms was potent. However, in a conscious act of counter-conditioning, she remained in his proximity, allowing herself to re-engage with a state of calm. The intrusive symptoms of past trauma showed a reduction in frequency and intensity. A shared routine began to establish itself, an external anchor to the present moment. Safety transitioned from an objective to an ongoing condition. July introduced an environmental stressor, oppressive heat across the city. Lena exhibited a residual hoarding instinct, stockpiling work shifts against a threat that was no longer present. Adrian, conversely, externalized his protective compulsions, founding an entity named Safe Haven Solutions. Its inaugural case involved a subject, Maria, entrapped in a cycle of intimate partner violence. Adrian's unit executed the extraction with a clinical efficiency Lena recognized from her own case file. She observed him command the operation, fueled by a core belief in universal salvageability. She labeled him a monster in his proficiency, a compliment he deflected with a statement of profound futility. "It is never sufficient," he articulated the rescuer's fundamental burden. The dissonance between the problem's scope and the limitations of his agency. Lena provided a cognitive reframe shaped by her own survival. Macro-level change is impossible, but micro-level, individual transformation is absolute. "You operate within the bounds of the achievable," she stated with quiet authority. "For all else, you must rely on the probability of other actors, just as I relied on you." The patient-rescuer dynamic inverted. She became his stabilizing agent. His surprise met her assertion that this capacity was innate and his perception was only now adjusting. August arrived, 6 months post-incident. A psychological chronometer marked the passage of time. Half a year of stability, a period of reconditioning to benign physical contact. Then, within a mundane grocery store, a figure from her past trauma manifested. It was not the primary abuser, Ethan. The primary aggressor was incarcerated, but this was Derek, his subordinate, an enabler who had historically derived gratification from observing her distress. Visual contact was made, and initial recognition curdled into a familiar expression of contempt. His vocalization disrupted the ambient noise, deploying textbook verbal assault. Ethan's pathetic fabricator. Her physiological trauma response activated, the instinct to appease, minimize her presence, and de-escalate the perceived threat. However, that conditioned persona was no longer dominant. His downfall was self-orchestrated, she countered, her voice tight with an adrenal response. My role was limited to factual testimony. His sneer was dismissive. He provided everything. He provided contusions, she retorted, and 8 months of confinement. Lena advanced, a nonverbal refusal to retreat. Therefore, yes, I testified. I detailed his actions, and I would repeat my testimony without hesitation. A vasodilation was observed on Derek's neck. He initiated a forward movement, but Adrian materialized. A physical barrier between Lena and her past. Depart, Adrian instructed, his unnervingly calm tone arresting Derek's motion. You will reverse course and exit immediately. Any future communication will result in a practical demonstration of profound regret. This was delivered not as a threat, but as a clinical prognosis. Derek's perception of Adrian shifted, recognizing a capacity for contained violence that far exceeded his own. This assessment of a superior capacity for harm caused Derek's posturing to cease. Adrian remained immobile until the threat de-escalated. Though Lena exhibited adrenal tremors in her hands, her vocalization was controlled. I am stable. I confronted him. I did not appease. My psychological state is altered from 6 months prior. I experienced extreme fear, she admitted, articulating the clinical definition of courage, the confluence of terror and deliberate action. The confrontation served as empirical validation of her psychological transformation. Her recovery was no longer a hypothesis, but a functional, stress-tested faculty. That evening, within their established, safe environment, Lena initiated the next phase. I request your presence, she stated. Not in the secondary bedroom, in here with me. His gaze was an assessment, a final check for any indication of duress. I am certain, she affirmed, her tone unwavering. My period of fear-based decision-making is concluded. Henceforth, desire, not fear, will be my primary motivator, she declared, codifying her new behavioral principle. His soft okay conveyed complete acceptance. Within this framework, they began to cultivate a new intimacy, a nonverbal paradigm of trust developed in the aftermath of conflict. Past trauma functioned as a latent threat, where tactile stimuli could trigger a severe withdrawal response. Adrian's patience provided a consistent, non-threatening boundary. She was internalizing this, learning self-regulation. Slowly, appetitive drives began to supersede fear-based avoidance. Later, in a nocturnal state, she identified an emotional condition previously thought to be permanently inaccessible: serenity. Its etiology was not the absence of psychological scarring, but the stability of her present reality, a life constructed next to the individual who witnessed her decompensation and remained present. I love you, she vocalized quietly, the declaration serving as a foundational statement. He increased physical pressure. I love you as well, her addendum, despite the catastrophic state of my life. You are not a catastrophe, he corrected with clinical certainty. You are a survivor raising an empire from its own ashes. It is a fundamentally different state of being. This is a manifestation of love. I am stating an observable fact, he countered, which is potentiated by my affection for you. A smile formed in the dark as she entered a state of rest, her cognition now oriented toward future planning instead of trauma rehearsal. September arrived, initiating a period of psychological renewal in New York. The subject observed the dawn from their shared apartment, a residence where her legal status had been formalized for 2 weeks. In the background, Adrian's movements in the kitchen provided a consistent auditory anchor, forming the routine of a life they were co-constructing. She had ceased her compulsive acquisition of supplementary hospital shifts. The word no integrated into her vocabulary as a boundary-setting tool. She was, as per her therapist's directive, engaging in self-preservation. The hospital presented a paradox, both sanctuary and source of profound stress, a system that nearly induced identity erosion. Coffee is prepared, Adrian's voice interrupted. She turned, observing him with 2 mugs, his hair displaying signs of recent sleep. This presentation of Adrian, unarmored, relaxed, in a simple t-shirt, was the stimulus for her deepest attachment, superseding archetypes of CEO or rescuer. Simply Adrian. And he was her partner. The subject initiated routine intimacy before inquiring about legal counsel. He confirmed the 10 o'clock appointment, defining a 2-hour strategic window. The Safe Haven Foundation was his project, a structured mechanism to provide what Lena was denied: legal aid, sanctuary, therapy, and an extraction plan. With the nonprofit's articles filed, the entity became legally real. "I'm having trouble processing this," Lena stated, her vocal tone indicating high arousal. This was not a confession of doubt, but a symptom of profound wonder resulting from positive cognitive dissonance. "A year ago," she observed, "my environment was a subway car. Now I'm co-founding an institution. The cognitive leap feels impossible." He initiated physical contact, reframing her survival as an extreme act of psychological resilience, a beacon for others. "When did you adopt this optimism?" she inquired into his chest. "It's realism," he corrected, validated by an individual who proves positive outcomes are possible. She registered olfactory cues, linking his scent signature to the psychological concept of home. The morning was allocated to document analysis. Lena exhibited hypervigilance, deconstructing every clause, a corrective behavior for past exploitation. She engaged in intense questioning and documentation, thus activating her full agency in the partnership. The meeting concluded with success. Safe Haven was a legal entity, listing Lena as co-founder. The title registered as a psychological burden, a form of imposter syndrome. She was internalizing the concept that identity is forged through action, not a feeling of readiness. "Lunch," Adrian proposed, a standard celebration ritual. "I have an alternative," she countered, "the subway." His confusion was apparent, but he complied. "There is a specific locus I must revisit." They traveled to a platform she had not visited in 1 year. She had previously engaged in conscious avoidance, treating the location as a memorial to trauma. This visit was a deliberate confrontation. The sensory data was unchanged: stained tiles, the scent of ozone, the vibration of an approaching train. The memory was intact. Lena moved to the exact location of her breakdown. "This is where you intervened," she said, her voice steady. "My psychological state was one of complete disorientation. I believed the floor was the lowest point." She faced him directly. The actual worst case was an absence of intervention, a return to a static, inescapable environment. She preempted his reassurance. "Perhaps. Or perhaps I would have become another statistic." "This is not for dramatic effect," she clarified. "It is a necessary acknowledgement of your unconditional support." Adrian's posture relaxed. "No debt is owed." "I know, but the statement had to be made here, at the origin." A train arrived, disgorging a stream of people. She observed them as subjects in their own unobserved conflicts. A year ago, she was indistinguishable from them. Any one of them could be near their breaking point. This validated the Foundation's purpose: to replace chance with the system. They remained briefly before returning to the street. The city entered a phase of lower afternoon activity. They walked in shared silence, punctuated by low-stimulus commentary on urban aesthetics, construction, and the economics of high-priced beverages. It was a period of mutual de-escalation. At their residence, Lena prepared for her self-defense class. Adrian had cautiously suggested the activity, aware that combat simulation could be a trigger. Yet she felt a primal imperative to acquire skills for autonomous self-preservation. The class was a single-gender group led by a trauma-informed instructor. "I can retrieve you later," Adrian offered. "Unnecessary. The subway is sufficient." "I know it's unnecessary," he clarified. "It is my preference." Lena signaled her assent with a kiss. Agreed, but only as a matter of logistical convenience. The 90-minute class was intense, focused on overriding the freeze instinct with kinetic action. Lena departed with elevated adrenaline, experiencing a sense of innate, unsanctioned physical power. Adrienne was waiting as planned. In the vehicle, she demonstrated a palm heel strike, eliciting a flinch response. "Mental note," he stated with a smile. "Do not provoke." "Impossible. Your reasonableness is a constant." "Allow for time," he countered. "I can develop irritating qualities." They acquired food from a familiar establishment, a predictable, comforting ritual. This mundane pattern of existence was a state Lena had previously assessed as irrevocably lost. Post-meal, her heightened physiological arousal continued. The subject's excess energy was a product of adrenaline and cognitive hyperactivity. "Let's walk," she proposed. They gravitated toward Battery Park, a site associated with the verdict. The environment was a complex field of light and sound stimuli. Ferries traversed the water. Tourists photographed the Statue of Liberty. "I have been processing a thought," Lena began. "Cause for alarm?" "I intend to resume my education, to acquire a teaching degree as I planned before the disruption." Adrienne smiled. He offered a positive projection of her success. Her own self-doubt immediately manifested. "Or a catastrophic failure. I question my capacity to manage the stressors." He reframed it as a low-risk experiment with two potential endpoints: cessation or long-term success. "When did you assume this role of my champion?" she asked. His response was precise. "On the day your cognition shifted from mere survival to aspirational planning, that marked your choice to live." Lena remained silent, processing this timeline against her memory of a survival-only mindset. Now her plans extended beyond the immediate future. This stability was fractured by 3 words: "I'm pregnant." The statement was an unplanned, impulsive disclosure, released under the weight of the information, disrupting the ambient calm. Adrienne's body went rigid. "To confirm, I'm pregnant," she reiterated. "Approximately 6 weeks." She then initiated an anxious monologue, attempting to manage his potential reaction by offering contingencies. He interrupted her with her name. "Lena." His sharp vocalization cut through her thought cascade. "Are you happy?" The question was a cognitive shock, redirecting her focus inward. It triggered a flood of catastrophic ideation concerning her maternal fitness and the state of the world. Beneath the terror, however, she identified a current of hope. "Yes," she whispered, "I'm happy and terrified." "Then I am too." Adrienne initiated a firm embrace. "We are having a baby." The reality remained a psychological echo for her. Is this certain? This changes the entire equation. This exceeds the parameters of our agreement. "I agreed to you," he interjected, his tone anchoring. "The complete entity, including all emergent complexities." This unconditional reassurance caused her emotional control to fail, resulting in a cathartic release of tears. He provided a fixed point of physical support. Her thoughts turned to logistical necessities. "There are disclosures to be made." "There is time," he assured her. "The timeline is your decision." They walked home, their conversation shifting to domestic preparations. The situation was assessed as absurd, terrifying, and fundamentally correct. Subsequent months were marked by medical oversight and nausea, while Adrienne acquired data on pregnancy as if from tactical manuals. Lena made the necessary professional disclosures. Dr. Shapiro reacted with detached amusement, classifying the event as professionally stimulating. The Foundation's launch in November, with its attendant media, provoked a visceral, aversive reaction in Lena. She rejected the hero narrative, viewing her survival as merely not succumbing. Adrian reframed her trauma narrative as a potential guide for others experiencing similar crises, proof that recovery and reconstruction were viable outcomes. Their first case materialized that week. A female, Sarah, presenting with a mandibular fracture and 3 broken ribs inflicted by her boyfriend. Lena provided support in the clinical setting, accompanied her to the precinct, and reframed reporting as an act of self-defense. Observing Sarah's progress toward internalizing her right to safety, Lena fully grasped the efficacy of their foundation. She recognized how the framework of her own trauma could be repurposed into a protective structure for others. December introduced a severe snowstorm and the festive energy of a New York holiday. At 16 weeks, her nausea subsided as her body commenced a significant physiological transformation. Adrian adopted the role of a sentinel, implementing a strict dietary protocol and mitigating all potential stressors, treating her as a high-value asset. "My condition is pregnancy, not fragility," she asserted as he removed a grocery bag weighing less than 10 pounds from her grasp. "Acknowledged," he replied, "but you are carrying the mission's most critical payload. My vigilance is therefore required." There exists a boundary between protection and obsession. Noted. I will persist in my attempts to locate it. Christmas was observed with their constructed social support system. Marcus, his wife, Patricia Reeves, a key ally during the trial, and operators from Adrian's team. The roles typically filled by family of origin were vacant, a silence denoting the termination of toxic relationships. Yet a chosen family can demonstrate greater validity. Adrian's primary gift was a leather-bound journal with her initials. "A mission log," he clarified. "For your cognitions, your anxieties, intelligence, for the child, for what they can process our history. It deviates from your typical methods, but I theorized you'd require a full operational debrief." She began documenting that night. Not daily, but as thoughts surfaced, she recorded data points large and small. Emesis at 0300 hours, the first fetal movement, a text from Sarah confirming divorce proceedings had begun. January arrived, marking the anniversary of the incident on the train platform. Lena emerged from sleep before dawn, with Adrian's stable presence beside her. She reflected on the complete redirection of her life's path. 1 year prior, she was dissociative, convinced her narrative had concluded. Presently, she was constructing a sanctuary, gestating new life, and experiencing a reality of profound fulfillment. She moved from the bed to the window, observing the city's activation, the initial commuters, the sound of trucks, the relentless rhythm of New York City. Her phone vibrated, a communication from Sarah, 1 month secure. "Awoke this morning without fear. You demonstrated this was possible." A slight smile formed as she replied, "You were the operative who executed the action. I merely provided illumination." Adrian located her 20 minutes later, observing the sunrise. "Is the situation nominal?" he inquired. "Better than nominal. Just assessing the new strategic reality." "Any reconsideration?" "Not one." He joined her to watch the sky. A foundation meeting was scheduled in hours, a birth in months. Beyond that, mission parameters remained undefined. But Lena no longer exhibited fear of the unknown. She had learned one can rebuild on cleared ground, that attachment could be a shield, and that a fall is not synonymous with defeat. February delivered a communication from a past entity. The return address was a state correctional facility. The sender was Ethan. For a sustained moment, Lena remained static, aware of Adrian's observation from the kitchen. The letter's content was unexpectedly rational. Therapy, he wrote, was proving effective. It was an apology, an admission of culpability, not a petition for forgiveness. He understood her flight, was glad she was safe, and expressed hope for her future. I do not know why I am so documenting this, the letter concluded. No response is required. You have no obligation to me. I wanted to inform you I am attempting to become someone other than the man who fractured you. Not for you. For me. I am sorry for everything, Lena. You deserved better. You always did. Lena placed the letter on the counter, experiencing not anger or pain, but a sense of final psychological closure. It was the maximum he could offer, an acknowledgement of the harm, an effort at self-rehabilitation, and the courtesy of non-contact. It did not negate the trauma, but it was a conclusion. Will you respond? Adrian's tone was subdued. No, he is correct. I have no obligation to him, but I hope he achieves recovery for his own sake. She folded the letter and deposited it into the waste receptacle. There was no ceremony, just a document joining the day's refuse. Some pathological figures, she concluded, do not warrant continued cognitive space. March arrived with a warmer climate, advancing Lena into her final trimester. Hospital duties required reduction. Her body was exhibiting stress responses to the 12-hour shifts. The physiological cost was notable, but the foundation was operating successfully. She was training new personnel and developing new protocols, constructing a system designed for longevity. Amid this, they learned the fetus was female. The technician's report breached Adrian's stoic composure. A complete, spontaneous, emotional display? Lena referenced the event for a week. I am permitted an emotional response, he defended. It is a daughter. A small combatant currently utilizing your bladder for tactical drills. She will be a legend. She will possess your spirit, your resilience, and your poor taste in television. You are solely responsible for this bachelor fixation. I only observe that sociological disaster with you, so do not assign blame to me. For weeks they debated a name. He preferred something traditional. She required a name with historical resonance. They settled on Elena Grace, a name carrying Lena's lineage, while allowing for a new identity to form. Grace was selected as the middle name, a dark acknowledgement of the mercy they received instead of a terminal outcome. April manifested with blooming cherry blossoms, the city's ambient tension underlying the aesthetic. At 36 weeks, Lena perceived herself as a large vessel navigating between exhilaration and profound apprehension. She substituted parenting literature with Adrian's tactical guides, simulating birthing scenarios as a mission. Yet in nocturnal quietude, fear was a persistent cognitive intrusion, a fear she was unqualified for command of this child, unable to break the cycle of her own dysfunctional upbringing. Dr. Shapiro reframed her hypervigilance as a functional asset, stating one must first identify hazards to navigate a field. You successfully extracted yourself, Shapiro had said. You built an organization from nothing. You are authoring the new protocol for retrieving others from that same hostile environment. Trust that the same resilience that ensured your survival will make you a capable mother. But what if I damage her? You will. All parents do. The objective isn't perfection. It is survival and recalibration. You will cause harm, then assess and adapt. You will make an error, take ownership, and pivot. That is how the chain of trauma is broken. Lena utilized this intel during periods of sleeplessness. That was an objective she could comprehend. The initial signal occurred on a Tuesday morning. Lena was organizing their safe house with the physiological alert registered, less a pain than a profound, seizing pressure. "Adrien," she vocalized, "it is time." He appeared instantly, securing the go bag that had been prepared for the last 3 weeks. "What is the interval?" That was the initial onset. "We have a limited window, hours possibly. We need to reposition. Protocol suggests we wait for closer proximity. Or we can advance now, establish a perimeter." Lena suppressed a slight smile. "Your operational detachment is failing." "I'm being prudent." "Your fear response is palpable. It's strangely compelling." A tactical agreement was reached. When the events reached 10-minute intervals, they proceeded to Mount Sinai. This was familiar terrain, affording her a distinct psychological advantage. The personnel acknowledged her arrival, installing her in a secluded room with the subdued competence of professionals accustomed to trauma. No intelligence briefing could have accounted for the reality. The ordeal was a severe psychophysiological event beyond any analog. Lena had observed this process in others, but to experience it was to enter another state of somatic distress. The instinctual vocalizations now made sense. Adrien maintained his support posture, holding her hand, relaying data, and absorbing the displaced hostility she directed at him. "You are responsible for this," she stated between contractions. "Understood. My culpability. You are a force of nature. I love you. At present, I despise you." A reasonable reaction. 18 hours later, an assertive cry marked the arrival of Elena Grace Valente. The infant was placed on Lena's chest, a minuscule, potent entity, new to this environment and perfectly formed. Lena observes her offspring, and a fundamental mechanism resets within her psyche. The emotion is so intense, it becomes a defensive tool, a primal directive to safeguard that negates her former anxieties. "Hello, new operative," she whispered. "I am your designated guardian. I will make errors, but I assure you I will neutralize all threats to you. That is a certainty." The infant's distress vocalizations ceased as it sought visual contact with the maternal subject, Lena. The paternal subject, Adrien, approached, offering tactile support and designating the infant as a flawless symbol of victory. The subsequent 48 hours were dedicated to mastering the procedural logistics of the infant's biological needs and interpreting its vocal data. The transition from the clinical to the domestic environment was reported as a hallucinatory experience. Transferring the infant, designated the asset, into the residence was a disorienting event. After placing Elena in her cradle, both subjects maintained a fixed watch, observing her as if she were a volatile device requiring constant vigilance. Lena's verbalization that the new operational phase had commenced was received as a significant stressor. Adrien's response confirmed their mutual descent into a chaotic system. The initial weeks were characterized by tactical nutritional delivery and sleep patterns, fragmented into 90-minute cycles. While attachment was an expected variable, the associated anxiety was an unforeseen complication. A routine of continuous diagnostic checks was implemented to ensure the infant, Elena, remained functional. Every vocalization was processed as a system alert, exacerbating paranoid tendencies. The pressure of maintaining the infant's viability was a constant stressor. Amid this, the subjects established a functional rhythm, alternating duties and requesting external support to prevent systemic burnout. The subjects noted the high durability of the new asset and observed that interpersonal loyalty could stabilize an operation compromised by faulty intelligence. A support structure was rapidly established, with Lena acting as the central coordinator. She recruited Michelle, a retired operative familiar with the system's mechanics and its inherent psychological toll. Since its activation, the unit had performed 43 successful extractions from terminal situations. This represented 43 individuals diverted from catastrophic outcomes. During the summer, the 3-month-old infant Elena began to exhibit a heightened environmental awareness, interpreted by the subjects as pre-professional aptitude. Lena's excursions to the park were repurposed as a new operational theater, where she formed alliances with other mothers by exchanging intelligence on logistical concerns. Her psychological state shifted from hypervigilance to active environmental control. This chaotic domestic domain became her new command, built upon the foundation of her past trauma. At the 103rd Street platform, the site of the initial trauma, the atmosphere was heavy with historical significance. With Elena secured to her and Adrian providing rear security, she stood at the point of her psychological collapse. He questioned the location, to which she replied, "Elena needs to know her genesis, the point where I accepted the exfil." Observing her daughter's fascination with the tunnel lights, Lena contemplated the future debriefing. She would one day convey the operational details of her breakdown and Adrian's role in her extraction. She framed the narrative as a necessary tactical retreat before a main offensive, a concept she was confident her daughter would grasp. She concluded that a competent partner fundamentally alters the operational equation. Addressing Adrian, Lena articulated a new core principle. Their bond was not a tool for conflict, but its ultimate objective. He deferred credit to her. "Perhaps," she conceded, "but you were providing cover fire for the rebuild. That means everything." A train's arrival broke the moment. The journey was a symbolic act of dominance over past trauma. Lena required this expedition with her family unit to solidify her personal agency. The rail system that once delivered her to a psychological nadir now transported her through a reclaimed city, passing the station that had been her prison. As the train passed the platform, she experienced no effective response, only the dispassionate satisfaction of a completed objective. The traumatized persona from the apartment was gone, replaced by an individual who distinguished survival from victory. That night, Lena began to use the logbook Adrian had provided. The journal contained the data of her new life, with the primary objective section left blank until that moment. Her entry began. "My dearest Elena, by the time you read this, you will know that official reports are incomplete. You will have been told the narrative of the platform and of your father extracting me from that event. But the true origin point was earlier, at the moment of my cognitive shift from compliance to defiance. You were conceived from that single choice, from the life I systematically dismantled and rebuilt, the authority I reclaimed, and the faith I risked. You are not a symptom of my damage. You are living proof that the past does not determine the future. Your father and I are both psychologically compromised. We will make errors. We will have minor tactical failures, and we hope to avoid any strategic ones. But our support for you will remain a savage, unwavering absolute. We will teach you that to fail is an operational risk, that calling for aid is a sign of strength, and that you owe no allegiance to any entity that seeks to reduce you. We will be your evidence of how two damaged soldiers can forge a dynasty from ruin." Thus, observing her daughter, Elena, she perceives the complete architecture of her victory. It comprises the child, the dynasty under construction, and the covert network that extracts others from crisis. This is not a recovery, it is a display of conquest. This is her definition of victory. Profoundly scarred, but deliberately achieved and worth the cost of the conflict. The text on the page was a final directive from her own mother. I will see you become the leader who forges a new world from the freedom we died for. This savage chaos is here, and it is ours. Lena closed the book with a sharp sound, sealing her trajectory. Outside, the city contained 1,000,000 fractured lives, all struggling for survival. She had not simply experienced a recovery, but had actively engineered a new existence. Her mind now functioned as a strategic center, not a repository of trauma. She planned Elena's training regimen as her network expanded from dozens to hundreds. Public events were reconfigured as demonstrations of power. This was not peace, it was the establishment of a dynasty. She awakens to Adrian's form, watching over Elena, his voice modulated to a low frequency for the infant. Lena observes from the periphery, her future secured by the agent of her extraction. Her gratitude has been repurposed from a liability into a functional asset. This is not a gentle conclusion, it is the silence that follows the complete incineration of a former world to build a new one. This, the analysis suggests, is the nature of existence, brutal, fragmented, and mythic. And Lena Carter, the former ghost, the mother, the founder, who weaponized her own pathology into a beacon, had moved beyond survival. She was, with finality and certainty, the architect of her reality.